Very interesting. Is economics a science? What's the difference between a scientific law and an economic law? You brought up the law of diminishing marginal utility. How is that kind of law different from a physical law? For example, Einstein's general relativity.
Yes. Now that is the question, isn't it? So, okay, if you ask many Austrians, they will give a slightly different answer than what I would give. So I'll just kind of put everything on the table as concisely as I can. They would say that economic laws are purely, I guess one way to say it is logico-deductive or deductive from certain axioms. That's what they would say. They would say it's a lot like a mathematical proof that's not subject to empirical testing, whereas the laws of general relativity are empirical in a way that the laws of economics are not. That's what they would say. I think there are a couple ways to improve upon the standard Austrian explanations of the difference between their laws and the laws of physics as we know them. One of them, as you well know, is that the word axiom should raise an eyebrow. And so we can simply replace axiom with conjecture. You know, we can say, okay, economics is predicated on the conjecture that universal explainers act in a world of scarce resources and opportunity costs and the possibility for the growth or reduction in knowledge. That's perfectly fine. And then work out the consequences of that. Then there's the issue of how economics emerges as a field from epistemology. But I want to table that because I think that'll take a little bit of elaboration. We can certainly get back to it. I would love to, actually. But let me just table that for now. But I want to flag it. And then finally, there's kind of the issue of testing economic testing Austrian economics and its principle and its predictions and that sort of thing. And I think the first thing to say about that is really, as you know, our eye should more be on explaining reality rather than testing. You know, testing has its role, of course, but it's only when we have at least two good explanations for a given phenomenon. And insofar as we take, for example, Popperian epistemology seriously, that alone, as I sometimes say, rules out the vast majority of economic models, because the vast majority of economic models basically assume that human action can be algebratized, but creativity, by definition, cannot be put through a deterministic algebraic formula or model. And Austrian economics is explicit about that. They're not explicit about the Popperian part, but they're explicit about the fact that human action is unpredictable and open-ended, basically. And so, you know, this isn't an experimental test, but it is a kind of standard by which we can judge various economic alternative theories or rival theories. So rather than saying, look, Austrian economics and all of its theorems are predicated on the action axiom, as it's called, and therefore it has to be correct no matter what, just like theorem in math, we can say, okay, well, how about we take our best theory of epistemology, use it as a criterion against which we judge all of the rival economic theories and see which economic theory or theories remain standing. And lo and behold, if we work it out, it's Austrian economics. Okay, now to go back to your original question, I don't think fundamentally there's a difference between economic principles and those of physics. However, at the moment, given our best knowledge, we don't have a way of expressing, say, the laws of general relativity and the principles of economics in a single formalism. But this is one area where I think constructor theory will eventually shed some light. But again, that's kind of another rabbit hole. Happy to go down it, but I'll just say that for now. Yes, Austrian economics, as of now, it doesn't really have a formalism, because we don't have a formalism for expressing the phenomena by which people act creatively in a world of scarcity and opportunity costs and that sort of thing. What's needed is basically a formalism that can handle knowledge and counterfactuals and this sort of thing.
I definitely want to return to how economics emerges from Papyrian epistemology, or epistemology, as I should say, but I want to talk about the implications of Austrian economics first. If we are to take its principles seriously, how do we need to think of the state and the elimination thereof? Should we all be revolutionists and argue for society to become stateless tomorrow, or do we need to make incremental progress in the right direction? It'd be great if you could also explain what you mean by economic creationism and why you think so many people find it easy to reject God but find it hard to accept that society and societal order can emerge spontaneously. On that note, maybe we're going on a slight tangent, but why do you think Austrian economics is not popular?
Ha! You threw all the good ones at me all at once. Okay, let me take these one at a time. Okay, so regarding what economics tells us about what we should do about the existence of a government, or more generally, any institution or individual, I suppose, that violates private property rights or is parasitical in nature, that is, it drains society of wealth and this sort of thing. The most general thing I suppose I could say, again in light of epistemology, is that no ontological theory, that is, no theory about the physical world alone, can ever tell us what we have to do next. That is always a creative endeavor. So the relationship between physical theories and our choices is that physical theories serve as criticisms of the various choices available. So that's kind of a general statement. And so in a given policy debate, economics can certainly inform the various political options on the table. So the example I always use, because it's so straightforward and rudimentary, is, price controls, and then even more specifically, a minimum wage. Economics will tell us that basically a minimum wage will cause unemployment, because if I want to hire you, but I'm only willing to hire you for $20 an hour, and someone wants to implement a minimum wage of $25 an hour, then there exists a free trade, namely I give you an hourly wage and you give me your labor. This trade is no longer legal, and assuming we both obey the laws, this trade will no longer happen if the minimum wage is implemented. Now, if people don't know economics, then they simply won't have that criticism available. Now, if memory serves me correctly, I believe it was Murray Rothbard's protege, Hans Hermann Hoppe. And by the way, going back to the history of economics, Murray Rothbard was in turn Mises's protege in many ways. I don't think he actually worked under Mises, if I recall correctly, but he was basically his apprentice intellectually. And then Hoppe was literally Rothbard's apprentice. But anyway, in one of Hoppe's books, he worked out that the only societal arrangement in which everyone's preferences can be met is a fully private property society. And he applied praxeology, or Austrian economics, I should say, in order to deduce that conclusion. So that's another thing, another little tidbit to keep in mind. But again, this is quote unquote, merely a criticism of the existence of the state and state action. It doesn't alone tell us, should we incrementally privatize the state or abolish it, or should we be revolutionaries? Austrian economics and the theorems that we can deduce through it do not tell us what to do about it. Another thing Austrian economics tells us about the existence of a state, that is an institution with a territorial monopoly on the initiation of violence or on the institutional vitiation of private property rights, is that everywhere the state acts, it creates what one of the Austrian economists, I don't remember which, called islands of calculational chaos. And again, this is another rabbit hole we can go down. And it's actually very significant historically regarding the debates over socialism and capitalism in the early 20th century. But basically, everywhere the state acts, because it acquires revenue and resources coercively, it literally cannot possibly allocate resources efficiently. That is, in a way that best satisfies people's preferences.
So some call taking wealth away from where it is being generated fastest to where it is not charitable, or they'll call it a social responsibility. But why is that not efficient? Why would it only hurt more people? And to play devil's advocate a little bit, what are we to do about those in need?
Oh, and to bring us back to kind of the fundamentals of Austrian economics, because I think I forgot to say this. Sorry, we've been a bit all over the place, which is totally fine. Austrian economics is about the conjecture that universal explainers act purposefully. That is, they employ scarce means towards satisfying or fulfilling some end or solving some problem, if you like. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation because I'm pretty sure I have not used the word purposeful, which I should have. I should also add, Arjun, when I was talking about wealth, and I was saying kind of the economics view of wealth, well, one way to view it is just the set of all goods and services one can purchase. But the more general view, which comes right out of constructor theory and is made explicit both in the beginning of Infinity and also in the foundational paper of constructor theory, that you can take the constructor theoretic view in terms of transformations. That is, wealth is the set of all transformations an entity can conceivably perform. So a biological entity has some amount of wealth, a person has some amount of wealth, and a civilization has some amount of wealth. But I didn't want to be quite that general when I was talking about basically why welfare is a mistake. But I just wanted to flag that as well for you and whoever else is listening. I should add regarding the constructor theoretic view of wealth that it makes it a bit more obvious why knowledge is the limiting factor in our ability to make progress rather than some arbitrary raw material or a scarce resource or even a capital good. And we haven't spoken about the delineation between capital goods and consumer goods. Maybe we'll get to that. Because if wealth is the set of all transformations we can cause, well, by growing our knowledge, by increasing our knowledge, we are capable of causing ever more transformations of the physical world. Anyway, treat the last two chits as a kind of parenthetical. So for those interested primarily in Austrian economics, you don't necessarily have to worry about that. But if you're interested in a more integrated kind of worldview that incorporates Austrian economics and constructor theory and epistemology, then digest those last two chits, I would say. Okay, one more thing. So with this constructor theoretic view of wealth in mind, it helps us understand morality a little bit, by which I mean, so if wealth is the set of all physical transformations we can render, then morality or moral theories help us to adjudicate between which physical transformations we ought to render or which physical transformations we ought to pursue and which physical transformations we ought not to render or pursue. So moral knowledge is that knowledge which selects amongst the repertoire of all the physical transformations we're capable of causing. Moral knowledge selects which ones we ought to render and or pursue. Okay, so now to answer your question about economic creationism. Right, so economic creationism is the false idea that all of the order in society requires some top-down designer in order to come about, and that, in fact, without some top-down planner, there would just be chaos in society. The economic creationist thinks that if only the top-down planner or designer just passed the right laws or willed such and such into existence, willed some solution into existence, that therefore order would emerge in society and that our problems could be solved by fiat. Among other things, the economic creationist rejects the role that genuine creativity has in both problem solving on an individual level, on a societal level, and also in how the spontaneous order that is an economy in fact emerges. In reality, the economy is too complex for any single individual to plan in the first place. It has to come about spontaneously and voluntarily. And you asked why economic creationism is so prevalent. Well, the first generic answer is simply that the truth is hard to come by. And the reality that the complexity of an economy and the structures we see in an economy emerge without any top-down planner. They emerge just from individuals interacting, acting purposefully, solving their own local problems. That this idea is counterintuitive and required geniuses to figure out, much like humanity wasn't born with the knowledge of Darwinian evolution. That took, heavy thinking for thousands of years or centuries or whatever. And even then, it was a long fought battle for Darwinian evolution to permeate through the collective consciousness of people. But really, to make it more interesting, I think we can look beyond the generic answer, which is, given that Austrian economics is a century and a half old, and it's been worked out in many details since then, and the ideas of spontaneous order and voluntarism and all this stuff, human action, have been worked out in great detail with people like Hayek on spontaneous order and this sort of thing. Why is it that economic creationism is still prevalent even in the West, whereas biological creationism is not so much? The first thing to note, and I could be wrong about this, but from the history that I've read about and studied, it does seem that, again, I mostly speak about the West when it comes to this sort of thing, the collective view on economics was better in previous generations than it is now. So why, if that's true, why has our knowledge of economics deteriorated? I think at least one reason why economic creationism is so prevalent is simply that most kids go to school. I think I had mentioned earlier in our conversation that a lot of political positions are held unquestioningly because the underlying assumption that wealth is a fixed pie is itself held as axiomatic. And what is school if not a decades-long fixed pie that people are forced into? By the way, I think economic creationism is far more dangerous than biological creationism. And it's also kind of funny. Many of the people who will mock biological creationists will at the same time be economic creationists. Speaking in broad terms here, the biological creationist, generally speaking, does not want to impose his or her views of the subject on everyone else. And yet, on the other hand, the implications of economic creationism are such that bad ideas are forced upon everyone, or at least everyone who shares the polity with the economic creationist. And just another note on the school thing, I think it's not an accident, for similar reasons, that universities and colleges are also infected by so much economic creationism. And then you have these kids who have been in this fixed pie environment from 5 to 18. Then they go to college. They hear even more economic creationist views and that only good educated people think these things and bad people disagree, blah, blah, blah. And then those young people go out to society and spread the ideas even further. And this all connects to the fiat standard versus a hard money standard, which I won't get into now, but of course we can go down that rabbit hole. And so, again, I think the entire education system, I suspect, is a large reason why economic creationism is dominant, despite the fact that we have very robust, deep explanatory theories about how economics really works. Okay, now to answer your question on why Austrian economics is not popular in contrast with other schools of economic thought. And here, I think it's basically a hybrid of physics envy and this dogmatic insistence that a theory has to be mathematical to be valid. I think actually I sent some chits about this very subject in the Austrian economics room on Airchat. But yeah, there are a lot of economists who just bristle at the notion that economic phenomena could be explained in the absence of algebraic modeling. But to judge an explanation by the characteristics of its corresponding models in the absence of a good explanation for why we should prefer some models over another, I think is a mistake. And in this case, in fact, we should prefer mathematical models that are not deterministic, such as algebraic ones, for the reasons we've talked about earlier. We're dealing with inherently unpredictable phenomena because we're dealing with creative entities. I should be fair as well. Some economists reject Austrian economics in a way for good reasons, because they reject the fact that they reject Austrian economics because its proponents say that it is axiomatic. And we spoke about that earlier, so I won't repeat the arguments here. And many economists reject Austrian economics because they reject the logico-deductive methodology of Austrian economics and insist instead on developing models, quote unquote, based on the data and this sort of thing. By the way, we should distinguish between economic creationists who hold these ideas as anti-rational memes versus those who hold them as rational memes, in the sense that they are open to criticism and to changing their mind. There's a very big difference. And this is also true of anyone who is simply, for lack of a better phrase, economically ignorant. There's a difference between those who shield their conception of economics from criticism and those who are open. So as we talked about in other channels, many people who are economic creationists or some variant thereof, they'll say, basically anyone who disagrees with me is a bad person. They moralize, so they're shielding their ideas from criticism. So those memes they're holding anti-rationally. But other people are just, living their lives casually, just never heard Austrian economic ideas, and they just think, yeah, of course, we should have a minimum wage and a redistribution income. Yeah, why not? And they just haven't heard alternative arguments.
There's a lot of good stuff here. I want to talk about consumerism as it goes back to what you were hinting at, with wealth being the set of all physical transformations we can cause, and moral knowledge helping us decide between which physical transformations we actually ought to pursue. So knowledge of how to transform the world doesn't tell us anything about which transformations we ought to actually perform. That's where morality kicks in. Now, some people don't like capitalism because they think it takes away meaning from our lives and puts them into material things where it's all about buying things you don't want to satisfy people you don't know. They're talking about a problem also known as consumerism, but they directly link it to capitalism. How do you respond to that?
Yes, there are many answers to that question. The first is that capitalism, it's not primarily about seeking monetary profits or selling to people you don't know. Fundamentally, it's really just about private property rights and voluntary interactions between people. So such a society, in other words, a fully private property society or a fully capitalistic society, in principle, can be as consumeristic or as non-consumeristic as you can imagine. So, in other words, consumerism is a cultural attribute. It's not like if you have socialism, suddenly people are necessarily less consumeristic. Another way of thinking about this is to say that if by capitalism we just mean leaving people alone to do as they wish with their private property, they are free to be as consumeristic as they so choose or not to be. At least they have the choice. Whereas under communism, you don't have the choice. You're under the whims of the central planners. And who knows how there's no law of nature that says, oh, in a communistic society, the central planners are never going to be consumeristic. Who wrote that law? No one. Okay, now to make an economic point is that, ironically, the people who advocate for consuming a lot of stuff, well, I should say, a lot of the people who criticize capitalism at the same time think that consuming things drives the economy. So they're the ones literally advocating for consumerism. Whereas in reality, as I think Murray Rothbard said, production precedes consumption, or he might have said production precedes predation, but either way, they're both true. So, John Maynard Keynes famously advocates for literally a consumeristic, mindset and culture. And if I'm not mistaken, I think, was it George Bush towards the end of his, presidential, administration told people to go out and buy stuff to revive the economy. But again, what you want is ever expanding production to increase wealth, not consumption. Okay, so I haven't actually made an economic point. I've only made kind of political, historical points. So let me make an economic point now. Okay, so for an economy to expand, people have to invest in capital goods that are used towards the production of ever more and ever greater quality consumer goods that people then purchase on the market, or that the entrepreneur hopes that they purchase, such that the entrepreneur makes a profit. Okay, but the bigger the government, the more that they tax, the more that they, as I think I mentioned many chits ago, they lower the returns on entrepreneurial activity. In other words, they lower the returns on investment and savings. And investment and savings is the opposite of a consumeristic culture. When a person invests in some capital mode of production, that is, they put $1 away, or they give $1 to an entrepreneur, the entrepreneur then transforms raw materials into capital goods, and those capital goods into consumer goods that people buy. The person who invested that dollar, sorry, I keep messing up the chits. The person who invested that dollar ideally receives more than that dollar, and adjusted for the time that the person waited, in return. So that's how wealth creation happens in an economy, through investment, which is kind of the opposite of consumption. Now, many of the same people who decry capitalism and decry consumerism will at the same time advocate for taxing these very investments and entrepreneurial profits that I just mentioned, that, as I said, lead to the creation of wealth, the expansion of wealth, and the production of more and more goods and services at higher quality and lower cost. And as I said many chits ago, whatever you tax, you get less of, because basically you're lowering the returns. So those human actions fall lower on individuals' scale of values relative to other things, such as consumption.